Welcome, folksy folks, to Fabric of Folklore podcast. I'm your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is a podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And in this podcast, we attempt to shine a light on the parts of our culture that are so ingrained that we don't even know that they're happening, that we don't even take a second look. The stories that are passed down from generation to generation, the traditions performed at holidays, the food we eat at celebrations, all of these are part of ourselves, our communities. They all have a history and a fascinating journey. For example, a nationwide celebration called Punky Night is celebrated in England, but is generally concentrated in Somerset County. On the last Thursday of October, children sing a song dressed in medieval clothes, carrying punkies or hollowed-out pumpkins or jack-o'-lanterns. The song that they sing is "Give me a candle, give me a light. If you don't, you'll get a fright." And some believe that these punkies were carried by the men who were returning home late at night during the dark autumn fair season. And it is believed that these strange lights were made in order to ward off evil spirits. And obviously this has a connection with the Halloween celebrations that we celebrate today. And it is my belief that the better we understand our own culture and the cultures of others, the better we understand ourselves and one another. And from that understanding, we can hopefully become better humans. So if that sounds like a podcast that you are interested in listening to further, make sure you hit that subscribe button, whether you're listening or watching on YouTube or listening on your favorite podcasting platform. Today, we're stepping into the world of the spooky and unraveling the dark and creepy history and infamous legends of the American South with podcaster Brandon Schexnayder for another October Halloween episode. In his podcast, Southern Gothic, he uncovers ghostly stories, haunted places, and eerie tales through captivating storytelling, in-depth historical research, and an immersive audio soundscape. It's a really awesome podcast. You should take a listen afterwards. We'll be talking about 3 stories today from his show: The Curse of Julia Brown, The Boo Hag of Gulah culture, and The Legend of Stuckey Bridge. Brandon Schexnayder had a long career in Music Row, recording studios as an audio engineer, helping artists like George Strait and Leanne Womack make their albums. Brandon decided it was his turn to tell stories and create something for himself, so he enlisted the help of his sister, Brianne, an archivist, and Southern Gothic was born. So thank you so much for joining us on Fabric of Folklore today.
Thank you for having me.
So I like to start out with your journey, how you got into making this podcast.
Sure. Well, as you said, I was an audio engineer. So I spent a lot of time in recording studios, a lot of time in front of microphones already. So I knew how to make a podcast, but I wasn't sure what I was going to make, and really enjoyed kind of storytelling, really enjoyed a lot of stuff like that. I'm outside of Nashville, so a lot of my friends were into bluegrass and Americana and things like that, and that just it just all kind of came together. But when it comes to the spooky, that's certainly a lifelong enjoyment there, and doing with my sister certainly is part of that. We grew up down in New Orleans, and obviously it's the vibe down there, right? It's everywhere, but we had this extra little bit where our parents were amateur genealogists before the internet came out. So that meant that we would spend weekends driving all up and down the Mississippi River to go to these little old cemeteries everywhere for them to do research, and spent a lot of time out in the Louisiana heat in cemeteries as kids. So it serves them right. Their children now tell ghost stories because of that. So, yeah.
That's so awesome. And was your sister totally on board? Like, did you come up with the idea together, or how did that occur?
Well, I kind of came up with the idea on my own and was picking her brain about it, and kind of found that she had a lot to say about it, as siblings do, right? And
Yeah.
she had a lot of ideas, a lot of her stories, a lot of the stuff she was interested in. We joke it's kind of the premise, the basic premise we start with is we go and we find stories that your mama might have told you if you were growing up down here, one of these little towns or something, right? And we start with one of these stories that you don't really just kind of remember hearing as a kid, and then we go find out what's real about it. We go research, go look at census records, go check out, what the little micro history surrounding it might be. And so my sister definitely, she remembered a lot more from our childhood, and she had a lot more to do with kind of early episode ideas, as I kind of found my way around the storytelling part. Yeah.
And she's an archivist. That was her profession.
Right. Yep. She works down the Louisiana State Museum system, so she's actually works in the French Quarter down there still. Yeah.
Wow. So she really has a skill set for all this history
Yeah.
digging and.
Yeah, yeah. She took that bug from our parents, the genealogist research bug, and she made a career out of it. And and I kind of took the other side of that kind of more macabre side of hanging out at cemeteries. So yeah.
So, like, give me an example of how you would find a story. So, I know you
Hmm.
said that you have stories from growing up in New Orleans, which I'm sure is
Sure.
rife with stories. But assuming you run out of stories eventually from your own eh, family history, where do you go out to find these? Are you looking in the archives? Are you talking to
Right.
museum curators? Who are you talking to?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, once you get moving, I have so many piles of things to research that I'll never get to in my life. It goes really fast.
Hmm.
I've developed quite the collection of old books. We ended up doing a lot where we'll start looking at one story and find one of the things we really enjoy, and something we can talk about with some of the stories later today is not just necessarily telling a story, but figuring out how it came about, right? And
Hmm.
figuring out that the story is about something in, let's say, 1915 as Julia Brown. The story we'll tell later is but then finding out over time how the story changed, right?
Hmm.
And it did that in different phases. So you have a lot of books that came out in the 60s that had certain vibe to them. You had stuff came out later. Obviously, we have a lot of TV shows that tell stories now. um, so kind of just in the process of researching the ones that we knew about, you end up with books that are ghost stories from Louisiana from every different decade. And just these random books, and there's more in there, and obviously now I have a large enough listenership to where I don't struggle to at all for people to send things that they grew up hearing, them
Yeah.
telling me things. I get a lot of input from folks like that. If anything, the bigger struggle we have is not the quantity of stories, but it's ones that might have the depth to really go into it. I mean,
Hmm.
every town has a generic house that was abandoned and they made up a little story about, right? But not every town necessarily has one that's got a 30 minutes worth of content, I guess.
Hmm.
So that ends up being a little bit more of an issue of really finding ones that have a basis in history, have a basis and a little deeper background to it. Yeah.
And that's one thing that I think is unique about your show from other storytelling ghost story shows is that you really do the historical research, which I, particularly since this is kind of what my podcast is about, I really enjoy that element of your podcast. It really brings a depth to it that you don't
Thank
find
you.
in others.
Yeah, I think when we started off, one of the obviously, I was in music, and so I've been in creative pursuits for a long time, professionally. And when we started off, I kind of knew that we had to lean into what our strengths were.
Hmm.
I knew I could make good audio. I knew I could make it sound cool. My sister was fully confident that she could do good research, and so we really leaned into making those two things, very identifiable for our show, and then
Hmm.
kind of just hung on and hope that the rest came, you know, and it does,
Where
it does. Hmm.
you often put in little audio clips of
Hmm.
people that have been interviewed about these stories. Where do you get those from?
Well, so those are actually quotes. Those are written quotes that
Hmm.
we have replicated through voice.
Okay,
So those aren't actual original recordings or anything.
but
Yeah.
they're really cool. They're a really neat addition. I think I like that
Well,
element.
I think that's the ultimately with having a researcher involved, having somebody who they Brienne thoroughly enjoys, and I do too. This idea of having primary sources,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something that I think a lot of, paranormal shows and things like that, they don't really try and do, I mean, if you're going to tell me a story and it's going to say, someone said once, which, it's just a kind of a staple of ghost storytelling, local lore says, right? Well, um, really enjoy the ability to find where one of those original storytellers get as close to the source as you can, and that's what those try to be in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so, why did you limit yourself to the South? How come it's just the
Yeah.
Southern Gothic? And which states does that encompass?
I you know I It's I could definitely, if I talk about which states it encompasses, I get into trouble sometimes because there's a big debate over Texas over there, and
I know. Yeah, I was gonna ask, do you include Texas in your
um,
Southern?
it's there's a big debate about Texas. There's a debate about West Virginia sometimes. People talking about some of those, and even Arkansas. Sometimes people go back and forth with that. I haven't done
Hmm.
any Texas stories. I haven't. I'll admit that. Am I opposed to it? No. I haven't
Hmm.
made it. There's a lot of stuff there. Maybe one day you'll see some Texas stories. Um,
Well, San Antonio is ranked up there with New Orleans for ghost stories because of the Battle of the Alamo.
Yeah, I believe you. Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely a lot of stuff. I mean, I definitely feel like, I have family from East Texas, and I mean that
Mm,
they're just as hillbilly as the rest of us. So,
yeah.
I'm not gonna totally, not gonna define the South in those ways. But picking the region, it was almost more, it's something that we knew. It's something that I think it gives us this opportunity that's different than other shows that just cover
Mm,
ghost stories everywhere, because we
hmm.
can go in a lot deeper.
Yeah.
It gives us the ability. A lot of I really enjoy when we do shows that have stories that most people haven't heard of before, small town
Hmm.
stories, things like that. Ones that we're able to kind of pull out of a local regional book or something, and it hasn't been exposed to a larger audience, rather than
Hmm.
kind of harping on the same thing. We've done the Bell Witch. We've done Waverly Hills. We've done the classics, but at the end of the day, really being able to get deeper into it. And the South itself has a very interesting culturally, it's very interesting culturally because, um, a lot of bad stuff happened here. Okay. And, there's not that deep of a history in terms of a place, what could be here. Right. And
Hmm.
what we have is about 300, 400 years down here where, you just have this smattering of cultures all at once, and these people all
Hmm.
immigrated here. And you've got Scott Irish and Appalachia, and you've got the French colonization in Louisiana and Spanish in Florida. Just combined with the indigenous people who were here before, and the folks who were forcibly brought here from the African slave trade. So, you have this all in this short period of time, just this massive blending of cultures. And how could you not have unique stories come from that? Because all these
Yeah.
people brought these kind of presupposed notions, this folklore with them, and as they came to this new world, and these things blended together, you got really unique stories out of that. So, that's certainly something that we've really enjoyed doing, and sticking to it as a region. Yeah.
Hmm. Why do you think people are so fascinated with ghost stories and haunted, eerie tales?
Yeah. I mean, why are they so fascinated with true crime in general, right? It's certainly something that, it's wild. I mean, I find it wild at the same time that there is such a market for it. People telling me that they
Hmm.
fall asleep listening to the podcast. That's wild to me to think like that. I
I would not be one of those people. I
Yeah, yeah.
would.
Yeah, it just seems wild to me. But, I mean, because sometimes I lose sleep just researching some of these things,
Hmm.
but,
Hmm.
I don't know. It's something I enjoy telling. I think it's something that, with ghost stories in particular, true crime certainly has its own bit. With ghost stories in particular, what I think and what I find with a lot of is that it gives you the opportunity to kind of flirt with some themes like death, flirt with some themes of
Hmm.
afterlife and tragedy and things like that, without ever being fully exposed to it. It's got this kind of
Hmm.
fantastic veil in front of it. And, And I think it kind of gives folks an opportunity to think about that a little bit,
Mhm.
and that might be one. There might be who knows, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely think that there is the need to have these conversations in a way that doesn't feel so upfront and personal. And I think that that is definitely one reason we are drawn to ghost stories.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what I tell people. If you, when you, why do people go on ghost tours in towns, right? Why do you want to learn that history, right? And it's it's to hit a different spot in your imagination. Yeah.
Hmm. And what do you feel like you're getting out of this podcast? What surprised you that you
Sure.
didn't realize you were gonna, get
It's
from doing this
surprise.
podcast?
It's I honestly, it is a show that, well, Uh, that's an answer. I don't even I don't have a prepared answer for you. I mean, I love podcasting in general. I've fallen in love kind of with this kind of the independent creator industry a bit. I'm
Hmm.
certainly, have done well enough to where podcasting is my career now. I've kind of grown enough to meet some of my heroes in podcasting, and do a lot of like wonderful things. But man, a lot of the friendships that I've developed with other independent creators has probably been the biggest bonus of all.
Mm.
I'm not sure if you were looking for content wise,
No,
with
I
ghost
mean
stories, but yeah,
it's whatever you get out of it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I find that especially since my podcast is an interview style podcast, I am just fascinated at what people are studying and looking at, and it's just so fascinating to pick people's brains and to see what they're seeing through their eyes. And it's just a different way of looking at the world that I wouldn't have ever seen without doing this. So
yeah.
I think really it's a lot about meeting the people
Yeah,
in the
from the
industry.
perspective of actual stories and what we do in terms of that, I mean, it's certainly, um, I get a lot out of the storytelling. I didn't realize, um, how much fun it would be to interact and be in front of people and tell stories. I didn't realize, that part, how entertaining it would be because, this podcast is spurned at the same time, I'll go do live things as well. And, it never occurred to me that part would become such a large part, this kind of storytelling part.
Mm,
I looked at it at first as us making a podcast, but I didn't realize, uh, how personal with listeners and all it would become and actually telling stories. And that's
mm.
been certainly been a wonderful thing as well. Yeah.
So let's get into some of the stories that
Yeah.
we are talking about today. So the first one you mentioned is The Curse of Julia Brown. So can you give
Sure.
us an overview of what that story is?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you said three stories. I can get awful long winded. So we'll try and kind of, as some of these stories I could talk about for hours, with the amount of research we've done on some of these. But
Mm-hmm.
old Julia Brown, it's kind of one of the stories that we like to tell the most because it actually happened pretty close to where I grew up down there. It happened in the swamp, just north of New Orleans. So if you were to go driving up to Baton Rouge from New Orleans, you take I-10 up to Baton Rouge, and about halfway between the two, almost halfway, you'll kind of end up in the swamp. It's called Manchac Swamp. All right, and
Mm-hmm.
back in the early 20th century, back at the turn of the 20th century, there's a thriving little community there. It was called Frenier. In this community, they were harvesting cypress trees out there. It was a German community. All right. At one point, it was even called Schlosser. Okay. And this community, it was, yeah, again, Schlosser, German community, is all blonde hair, blue eyed people. I joke it was kind of like, look a lot like me at that point. But there's this one family that lived there on the edge of the town. And a woman by the name of Miss Julia Brown lived there. And Julia, she was born enslaved. Her husband, Celestin Brown, he had fought in the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. And they were an older
Mm,
couple at this point in time, right? They were all the way up in their 70s at that point. But they lived out on the edge of town, and he actually was given this property for his service in the U.S. Army. So they lived out there, and because Julia Brown, supposedly she was a bit of a root worker and practiced voodoo, because of that, in this isolated community, she kind of became the town's midwife, right?
mm,
She kind of became the person that if you had an issue, your only way to get back to New Orleans for help was by boat or by train. There was no roads in or out the swamp at that point. So if you need
mhm.
help, then you probably wanted to go see Julia Brown, right? Or if you needed a baby delivered, you might go see Julia Brown. And for a long time, Julia became a very important part of the community. She's very beloved. Folks really appreciated what she did. But as she got older, it started to change a little bit. Celestin passed away at one point, and folks said that for some reason she just kind of soured with the rest of the
Mm,
community. It might be that they started taking for granted, just expecting her help. Who knows? We might
mhm.
never know. But in her later years, they said that what she used to do is she started isolating herself out at her cabin at the edge of the swamp. And whenever anybody went out there to see what was going on, she'd just be sitting on her porch in this old rocking chair, and she'd just be rocking back and forth in this rocking chair. And she'd be singing this song: when I die, I'll take the whole town with me. When I die, I'll take the whole town with me. Now, I mean, you can imagine, right? Like, there's all these little blonde hair, blue eyed, German folk. They're running around. They don't really understand voodoo by any means at all, right? And here's this woman that is claiming to do that. So they definitely were scared. They didn't know what was going on, but it didn't bother them right away. But
Mhm.
one day, of course, Aunt Julia died. It was back in September of 1915, and we don't know how she passed away. We don't know what caused it or anything, but she was up there in age, so it could have just been old age. But of course, when she passed away, they were going to have a funeral for her as well. And that town, whether they really loved her because she was the one that delivered all their babies or they were scared to death, they were going to show up at that funeral, right? So September 29th, 1915, they have her funeral. Everybody packs into her funeral. Say it's standing room only there, to pay their respects to Julia Brown. But little do they realize, because they're so isolated out there in the swamp and have so little contact with the city of New Orleans or the outside world, that a hurricane was actually making landfall in southeastern Louisiana that day.
Mm,
And while
mhm.
they're there in that funeral, they're in that home where the funeral is taking place, the wind started to pick up and the rain started to fall. And the outer bands of that hurricane started to come in and hit Frenier. And all the storm surge started rising. And just all of a sudden, all of the winds and everything, and they're hearing. And you can imagine these folks just 3 days ago, this woman was alive, warning them that when I die, I'm going to take the whole town with me. And now a storm's breaking loose at her funeral. So folks obviously were scared to death, right? And they're running around, and this storm starts plowing through. And y'all, this was the largest storm, the largest recorded storm to date at that point in time. Now, this was prior to named hurricanes, so it didn't have a
Mhm.
name or anything, but it was the largest storm to date. And all those waters were coming, the water's coming down. People are scampering around looking for what they're going to do to save themselves. And the town starts getting flooded. They said people were running out to the train, getting on the train. And the train tried to take off down the road with about 30 people, and it only got about a half mile down the track, and they were stranded on the train. Other people were trying to stop themselves from drowning, so they were climbing trees up in cypress trees to get away from the rising water. But I mean, that was horrific in and of itself, because they could hear their friends and their family below them drowning, so they
Mhm.
might have survived the storm that way. So, all in all, that day, this hurricane took the lives of over 200 people.
Wow.
Frenier itself was almost entirely destroyed. And on Julia's body, of course, it floated out into the swamp in that casket. So, folks say to this day, we wonder, this was a real hurricane. This was something we can't deny. It's a fact that this hurricane caused this damage, and Frenier has never really come back. If you go out there now, there's a really great restaurant. You can go get some fried oysters out there. Other than that, there's a little swamp tour out there. The town, the community has never come back, and it's left people to wonder. Is
Uh-huh.
Julia Brown, was she really a voodoo priestess, or was she somebody who's warning them? Was it possible that maybe she wasn't cursing the town, but she loved the town so much, and she was really concerned that what they were doing and harvesting all that timber was really destroying the place that they loved? Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
We'll never know. So to this day, if you go out there, people say that you might hear her whispering in the distance, or you. There's been stories about folks running into her apparition, or seeing bodies floating out there, or screams from the trees. So it's a story that you can visit yourself out there in the swamp, and you can actually take a swamp tour on the land that Julia Brown used to own. So
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Did you as a kid go out there since you said you lived so close?
No, 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 no. I did not know about the story till much later. So my sister actually got really attached to the story. Um, she saw it first. I want to say it would have been her high school years. It probably was early 2000s. MTV did one of these scare shows,
Oh,
of
yeah.
a reality show, and they took people out there to that swamp. And I remember my sister seeing it, and it kind of really clicked in her that this is a place that we drove to all the time. You know, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
What do you think intrigued you about this story? Why you said
yeah,
that this is a story that you often tell in live storytelling events. What
right.
what brought you to it?
Yeah, well, this particular story, what's incredible about it is, this happened back in 1915. So this is not an incredibly old story in the grand scheme of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of documentation. We know about Julia. We know she was a person. She's on census records. That she had kids who she was married to. We've got military records for Celestin. We know she's a person. We also see
Mm-hmm.
that we've got a long line of newspaper records. So we know about her 2 days after her funeral. They actually had a newspaper article on it. Actually, kind of oh gosh, I can't believe I forgot the word. Not a eulogy. When you have a obituary, they had an obituary
Obituary.
for, in the newspaper, talking about her being this beloved member of the community, and that everybody
Mm-hmm.
came out. But the thing that was missing in those early records was any mention that she was a voodoo practitioner. Nobody talked about that. So
Mm-hmm.
it really formed this thing for us of being able to track down, okay, all the facts line up that she caused the hurricane, right? All the facts
Mm-hmm.
lined up to this story, this piece of folklore. But when did it go from 2 days before this storm, this beloved member of our community died? When did it turn into this beloved member of our community cursed us? And
Mm-hmm.
she's this full blown voodoo priestess. And
Mm-hmm.
earlier you asked, about doing, why I stick to the southern stuff mostly. And one of the benefits of sticking to a region like this is we get to see these recurring themes, and get to see how over the years, if you, a lot of times, if you tell me like kind of, what might be, I don't want to say a stereotype, or some type of cliche, if you will, or,
Mm-hmm.
or a trope of a story. A lot of times that points to specific times in the South, right? So we sort of
Mm-hmm.
have these different spaces of time when different stories were developed, and there was a point in time when voodoo became something that was kind of, it was hip, right? Or it was hip to not be hip. It was hip to be
Yeah.
scary. So we kind of we enjoy telling that story because we've been able to deconstruct it so much and see how, later in the 70s there was a newspaper article interviewing one of the children from Frenier, and they asked her, they said, hey, like, do you think she cursed the town? And she's like, oh, that's not how I heard about her growing up. She was a wonderful, if anything, she was warning us, right? So sometime before the
Mm-hmm.
70s, that this story had kind of developed that she'd cursed the town, but the people
Mm-hmm.
who actually were from there didn't believe it yet, and you kind of fast forward, and sure enough, you hit the early 2000s, and these TV shows will come out and they might feature her, and she's full blown evil,
Oh, wow.
and then it kind of, continues to change. So it's,
Uh-huh.
this particular story, for us, it just, it has given us the opportunity to see a story that's close to home, something that resonates with us, but also has really allowed us to look at what the humanity behind the stories are, because these are real people, you know.
Mm-hmm. And her not siblings, her children and great grandchildren, I assume, are still living. Have they spoken to this story at all?
So actually, we have no idea. Okay, we the census, it is so scribbled in the census records. Now her children, they were in the census records late 1800s. You know, like I
Mm-hmm.
said, in the later years there. So the records are so poor. We're not even 100% sure. So we've never been able to track down the children. Yeah,
Oh, that's
yeah,
unfortunate.
yeah.
Maybe someday someone will come out and say, I am the great great granddaughter or
Right.
something, and
Yeah.
we'll be able to. That's so interesting. So your sister, though, I think I read on your website that she's writing a book about Julia Brown. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, yeah, we're, it's been the white whale. Yeah.
Mm.
It's, this story has so many rabbit holes, you know,
Mm-hmm.
she's been going back and forth and working on it, and she'll take, 3 steps forward, and then she'll find
Mm-hmm.
another rabbit hole and realize, oh my gosh, maybe I can find this before I go further. So, we've certainly, it's certainly been something that's been back and forth, but yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So, talk to us a little bit about voodoo and how it's misunderstood in our culture today.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I even preface this with, like, I don't even feel like I'm an authority enough to discuss
Mm-hmm.
really voodoo when it comes down to it. But, it's a highly misunderstood thing in general. And what I learned growing up down there, of course, some of it was New Orleans stereotype. And there was certainly an element of it, but what it comes down to, voodoo and hoodoo, and what you see in New Orleans, or what you see with like Santeria, out in Florida, and out in Charleston with the Gullah people. Essentially what we had is these particular communities and these areas, these particular communities of enslaved people from Africa, had the opportunity to practice religion in a way that they didn't in other communities in colonial North America. Okay, so they had the opportunity to practice religion a little differently, and so in these places, which was primarily Catholic, they were given the ability to practice Catholicism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, what they did was they brought a lot of their religion from Africa with them and
Mm-hmm.
intermingled it into what Catholicism was. So a lot of times, what I've heard, is that voodoo isn't necessarily the religion; it's the lens that you see the world through, the spiritual lens.
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism's the religion, and voodoo is that kind of lens and the way you interact with ancestors, because it's a very ancestrally heavy religion. It's one that believes that your ancestors are looking out for you. You're interacting with the people from past generations, and that's really a core tenet of it. But it's
Mm-hmm.
practiced very differently everywhere. It's very personal.
Mm-hmm.
It's not it's not necessarily something that's got a governing body like the Catholicism is.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, it got a bad name, right?
Yeah.
Folks don't really understand it. It was considered to be a large part of Haiti when the revolution happened, and that was an enslaved population took over that island from the French government, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when that happened, folks here in North America saw voodoo as one of the initial causes of that. And then so a lot of fear came about, a lot more violence happened here, and being scared of what an enslaved uprising would look like. And voodoo was a part of
Mm-hmm.
that. But um, at the end of the day, horror movies, of course, have done the worst of the worst damage there. Even as recently as the 90s, like The Skeleton Key came out and just did this
Right.
horrifically stereotypical depiction. So it certainly got a bad name. It's certainly gotten a bad rap, for sure. It's still very much a thriving practice in Haiti, and
Mm-hmm.
in other Creole countries, and and in New Orleans, you'll still find a good bit down there for sure. But
Mm-hmm.
um, it's definitely seeped into a lot of those stories in very, very incorrect ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So, let's move on to the boo hag of Gulah culture. Is that how you
Yeah,
pronounce
yeah.
it?
You
Gulah?
talk about the boo hag.
The boo hag. So I listened to this episode on your podcast, and I have to say this is one of my favorite because I have never heard of the boo hag before, or
Sure.
I might have listened to. I might have. It seemed slightly familiar, but I don't know. For me, it was incredibly intriguing because of the deception and um,
Yeah.
the novelty. I think
Yeah.
of that story.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah. I'm sorry. You finish?
I was just gonna say, go ahead and tell the audience what the story is, so that they know what we're
Right.
talking about.
Well, it is unique as well, and it is a good segue from voodoo because this particular tradition, this piece of folklore, it's less a story and more folklore. It's more a creature,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, that it's from the Gullah culture, and the Gullah. This is out in the Low Country, on out South Carolina, of course, Charleston, that area, Savannah. All up and down that kind of East Coast up there, and what the Gullah people was essentially they were African people who were brought from the Rice Coast to come and farm out
Mm.
there on the eastern on those sea islands out there off the East Coast, and they were brought there, and they just the colonial Americans thought that this particular population was better suited to that region and growing rice. And they put them out of there on all these islands, almost entirely unsupervised in a lot of ways. So you have very isolated community that had this ability to maintain parts of its original culture. Now they were from all
Mm.
different places in Africa, so their cultures even in amongst themselves differed, in certain ways. But a new culture was born, and the Gullah and Geechee culture is still very much a part of Charleston and very much a part of Savannah and that those sea islands out there, and
Mm-hmm.
they're very proud of that cultural corridor there still to this day and protect it. So the Buhag comes from these folks, and what they believed is they believed in this particular creature called the Buhag. And I know in the podcast I tell this one particular story that's pretty much a generic tale that you would tell a kid. It's not about any particular individual, but it's often said that the Buhag itself, which is described as this creature that is like a skinless golem. Okay, it's skinless. It's got just, you see its muscle, it's gross muscle, and it's got claws and beady eyes, and maybe little tufts of hair sticking out, just slimy, hideous creature, right? But the thing about the boo hag is the boo hag has the ability to slip into a victim's skin and wear someone else as a costume, if you will, okay, to
Mm.
hide itself, right? So, the story most people talk about when they talk about boo hag is they often like to come and they like to they like to find single men in communities. Okay. And very often, as I tell the tale there, it's usually typically a gentleman who, maybe didn't get married and just kind of made it later in life, just kind of being okay, being alone. Right. And of course, he kind of just was never interested in ever getting married, never interested in women or anything. And, he eventually one day in his community, this beautiful woman arrives and he falls in love out of the gate. He
Mm-hmm.
sees this beautiful woman, she's charismatic. They go on some dates, and the next thing you know, he is head over heels over this stranger who's come to visit town, right? And of course, not long after that, he decides to get engaged and proposes to the woman, and the woman agrees. And the woman, of course, here's the kicker, right? She says, "All right, look, I'll get married to you. Absolutely, we'll get married, but I don't want to do it in a church. We're gonna go to the courthouse, right?" So he does that. They get married. And then, of course, he brings her home, and she moves into his house with him. And he's, of course, happy as can be, as a beautiful wife. And that first night when she's there in the house with him, of course, she cooks for him. And she does everything he ever dreamed, takes care of him, makes this giant feast and everything. I mean, he's eating everything he could possibly eat on the table, this beautiful meal. And then after it's done, she cleans the table, has him go hang out in the rocking chair over in the living room, and she sings him to sleep while she sits there and just kind of sews, right? So what more could this guy ask for, right? He's been putting off marriage. Why, if he's going to get that, right? Well, the next morning, wakes up. Of course, he comes out and has another wonderful meal, goes off to work, and it just does it again and again and again, right? It just kind of goes on and on. But over the next few days, he starts to know, one night he wakes up in the middle of the night. He's in his bed. He'd gotten in his bed and realizes that his wife isn't next to him. She wasn't there in bed. And he doesn't quite understand why, right? But he kind of plays it off. No big deal. Keeps going. Happens again. So he rolls over one night. His wife's not there. The next morning, he realizes she seems awful tired. And now he's starting to get a little bit suspicious, right? Is she coming to bed at all? Or is she
Mm-hmm.
putting him to sleep and then, you know, she's disappearing, right? Well, one night he decides to stay up and he decides to peek a little bit and he realizes that not only is wife missing, but like that next morning she's sneaking in right before. So he's really freaked out and he doesn't know what to do. And he goes to kind of try and find some of his friends and say, man, I need some advice here on what's going on because everything is wonderful. She's feeding me. She's cleaning from everything. I have this beautiful life now with this beautiful woman, but man, she's disappearing at night. But the thing is he can't talk to any of his friends because all the men in town somehow have turned up sick. And they've all seemed sick and he doesn't have anyone to talk to, nobody to go to. But what he does have to go to is there's a local root worker, a local conjure woman out in the swamp out there that he knows about, right? And she certainly can help him through this. Okay. So he goes out in the swamp and he meets this, and a lot like Julia Brown, right? This is somebody who just has the knowledge of just
Mm-hmm.
practicing and helping people, a little bit of the spiritual, old folklore, old legends. She knows how to help folks, right? And he gets out there to swamp and he starts describing to this conjure woman what's going on, everything that's going on in this house. And of course, what she says, her first question is, well, tell me about the men out there in your town. And he's like, well, I mean, they all seem to be sick. Nobody's going to work right now. Everybody's up in bed. It seems like everything, but and she's like, oh, okay. And she tells him, you married a boo hag. And of course, he doesn't know what that is, right? And she describes to him exactly what I described to you, just this vicious creature. And of course, he's in shock. He's in absolute shock as to what this is. And he wants to know, how do I fix this? How do I get rid of this? There's a demon in my bed with me, or not in my bed, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, right? Well, she tells him, well, what this boo hag is doing is every night when he's going to sleep, she's sneaking out of that house and she's going out, she's pulling off her skin. She's sneaking out of that house and she's going and she's sliding into other homes through little cracks in the windows and doors. And she's going up and she's mounting up on these men while they're sleeping and she's sucking the breath out of them like it's life force and feeding off of them. That's why they're getting sick. So if you want to do something about it, here's what you need to do. Tomorrow night, when you go home, you need to not eat anything whatsoever that she fixes for you. You need to stay away from that. And then what you need to do is you need to get some earplugs. And when you go sit in that rocking chair and she starts to sing, you better have those earplugs in because you don't want to fall asleep. But you need to pretend, right? And as you pretend to fall asleep and she thinks that you're finally asleep, you need to watch as she kind of starts to sneak out. And you need to see where she hides that skin before she sneaks out the door. And as soon as she's gone, this is what you need to do. You need to go upstairs and you need to find that skin and you need to take salt and you got to salt the skin, salt that skin down all from the inside and everything. And then you need to go and you need to take blue paint and you need to take this shade, this paint blue paint, and you need to go and you need to cover it in every window, every door and everything. And you need to just circle it because she can't get through this paint when she wants to come back. And you need to get all of this done before the sun comes up because that boo hag's going to get back in that house and you're done for if it is. So what does he do? he listens to that conjure woman, right? He goes and gets the blue paint. He gets the salt that night. He does exactly as what she said. He's hiding food, making sure she doesn't see it. He goes and sits in the chair there and he puts the earplugs in. She's singing and he starts to pretend like he's snoozing off, right? And as he's pretending like he's snoozing off, he realizes that, oh, she's about to start taking off that skin. And he kind of peeks out from beneath his eyes and kind of watches her peel off that skin. If you can imagine how gross that is, just peeling away that human skin. And then he sees how disgusting this woman that he married really is. And he's a bit freaked out. But as soon as she does, she's gone. The boo hag is out of the house. So as soon as she's out that door, he hops up and he gets to work, right? He goes out and he takes the paint and he's all around the windows, everything. He gets the salt. He goes up into the attic and he finds where she had put that skin and hid it. And he salts it down as best as he could. And he's just running everywhere trying to get this done. And he's out of breath. And of course, he just finally just crashes in his living room right before the sun comes up. And he just lays there scared, right? And the next thing you know, here's a giant thud. Well, the boo hag's trying to come into a window and she can't because all of the blue paint. And he hears this kind of crash and all around the house. She's trying every window, crashing into windows, everything, all he can possibly do. But then all of a sudden he realizes he didn't put paint around the window down in the basement. And the next thing you know, he realizes she's in the house. So he's sitting there and he hears her sneaking in and sliming in, and she goes running up the stairs, and he hears her running up the stairs because he sees the sun coming up and she needs that skin on. And she goes running up the stairs and she goes to put that skin on and she's throwing it on and she's putting the skin on. As soon as it gets on her, she feels all that salt and she starts to burn, and he hears her screaming upstairs in the attic with a giant crash as she goes falling out of that window and goes flying out into the swamp just as the sun is coming up. And what does the sun do? Just like a vampire, her exposed skin, she just starts to burn up in the sunlight. And that's what happens. He gets rid of the boo hag just as simply as that. So if you ever go down to Charleston, right, or out to Charleston, and you ever walk around downtown or just about anywhere in Charleston, there's two things you'll notice that come from this. If you look up on top of porches up there, all the porches in Charleston, man, I'm talking from the most meager homes all the way up, you'll see it painted this kind of sky blue, aqua blue color. It's called haint blue. And it's supposed to help protect the people in the house there from the spirit. But you also might have somebody might tell you before you go to bed, as a warning, don't let the hag ride you. And that's kind of that warning. All right, make sure you get a good night's sleep. Because, yeah, if you wake up breathless, it might be because the boo hag came into your home.
Wow, that's just such a cool and unique story. I mean, it's gross. It's really gross.
Yeah.
But I don't know. For some reason, I really like that one.
Well, it ties into a lot of folklore from all around the world. I mean, a hag is a very stereotypical, like a witch, right? So you got everything from, was it Baba Yaga,
Mhm.
you've got, all these different things in all these different cultures, right? And they kind of all take on different personalities. There's even Asian hags and hags from England, Irish hags, and all these different things. And the boo hag itself is kind of kind of a conglomeration
Yeah.
of this old folklore and the African tradition of hag in a lot of ways, which are more vampiric in nature than kind of more the child stealing witch, if you will.
Mhm.
So it's definitely a Americanization of old African folklore. Yeah.
Mhm. And where do you have a sense of where this kind of story came from? Were there illnesses in the Gula culture that people were trying to explain through the boo hag?
Sure.
What did you find?
Most likely what that is it's kind of a way that night terrors were interpreted. You
Mhm.
you have that kind of, you wake up in the middle of the night, breathless, right? You wake
Mhm.
up and you're in shock, right? You might see things. I mean, it's a fairly common occurrence, and you can imagine with the trauma at the same time that would have been in that community, that enslaved community. I'm sure it certainly is something they dealt with on a regular basis. So, um, I imagine it came as kind of a way to interpret that kind of psychological, trauma response for sure.
Mm-hmm.
That is if you
It,
don't
it
believe it.
it reminded me of I remember at one point I was sleeping at a friend's house and their cat came and slept on my chest and with her face right in my face. And I remember a story of like cats stealing people's souls. I don't know if this is a folkloric story or not, but that's immediately what I thought of after I listened to the Boo Hag story on your podcast. And I don't know if there's any connection, or if that is even something just that I made up, or if that is
Yeah.
something that it goes around in other cultures. Do you know?
I don't. I mean, I've definitely heard a lot of stuff, I mean, about cats being evil. They, is certainly, interesting, but no, I don't think it really ties in with the Boo Hag though, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was just immediately what came to mind when when I listened to that story. I was like, I wonder if there's some sort of connection, or if I just made that up entirely. Um,
Mhm.
Also, the history behind indigo. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about that, or the you call it the hant color,
Paint
the hant
blue?
blue?
Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I mean, essentially, in a lot. So indigo was one of the crops that was grown out there. It was grown down in southeastern Louisiana as well, and it was part of making royal purple, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
it was a very a good crop. It was a very
Mm-hmm.
lucrative crop. And this is something that those enslaved people out there on the Sea Islands were growing as well. So it's sort of that idea of what it was that they were cultivating protected them, but also that was part of the enslavement was that they were there to grow it. But the Haint blue itself, that shade took on that protective element, and they said that there's two things that can happen, right? There's two reasons why it might work, right? If you were to paint your porch ceiling with Haint blue, one of them is that this ghost, this Haint, this spirit, it's that they might just come up and it just looks like it's the sky, and they just might just float on through, right? And it's just a way,
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that folks said that they didn't like water, that they didn't want to be out over the water, and that color would
Mm-hmm.
just scare them away, and that's why they took it on. But the Haint blue is a very old tradition, and if you do head out there into the Low Country, I mean, like I said, it is on. I mean, that is used on houses, no matter how meager, all the way up to the mansions in Charleston as you walk around, or all up and down in that Low Country area. Yeah.
How interesting. This the folklore of indigo um, keeps cropping up for me. We had a guest on, Helen Inde, and she spoke
Hmm.
to us about the indigo folklore from Africa,
Uh-huh.
and how it was the crop that empowered women on the African continent, and it was only a tradition that elder women were allowed to produce
Yeah.
and make, and it really was what gave them their independence. And I think you mentioned in the podcast that a lot of the slaves that came over were brought over specifically to make that
Yeah.
indigo color, because they it was not a well known. It was a really tricky plant to harvest.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was this particular region of Africa was targeted for, this region of the Low Country to create these crops. These were people, I think a lot of times when people look at American history and they look at, what slavery looked like in American history, and this idea of we're enslaving people who were indigenous in their land, or who indigenous isn't the right word, who um, weren't advanced is really incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
This was another culture that was doing well.
Mm-hmm.
This was another culture that was having civil wars, was having
Mm-hmm.
a community. It was having, there was a civilization there that was doing well. Now, it might not have had quite the modernization of what the West had at that point in time. So these
Mm-hmm.
people were knowledgeable. And we talked about even earlier about the civil war, or excuse me, the war in Haiti, the revolution in Haiti, right?
Mhm.
One of the things is a lot of the enslaved people that brought over, they were either farmers, but they were also militarily trained, right? Because they were
Mhm.
fighting in civil wars, and they were fighting in communities in Africa. And those men who were captured were part of who was being sent over to America. So,
Mhm.
so it's very much, a part of this story, and very much of these cultures of they really did have a rich understanding of their life. And American history often isolates that, or people who look at American history, they want to they want to look at that enslaved culture as starting when they got here. And that's
Mhm.
just absolutely not true, and
Mhm.
deeply, problematic, and really understanding why they were able to do what they were here when they were here. Yeah.
Mhm. Can you talk? Are there variations to this Buhag story in the Gola culture? Were there,
Right.
different?
Well, I think there's variations just depending on how you grew up being told the story. I don't think,
Mhm.
this kind of that's a fairly general version that covers most. But yeah, I mean, it's like anything, just even with like the Julia Brown story, or something you might have heard in your hometown growing up. You certainly, I've heard little different parts of little attributes, but for the most part, that's what the story would say. It's like, "What did your mama tell you?" Kind of deal is what
Mhm.
happens for sure.
And what historical documentation were y'all able to drag up for this particular
Yeah.
story?
Well, most of what we found was this one wasn't accounts. So this wasn't like census records. We weren't looking for an actual boohag.
Mhm.
This was one more where you're kind of tracing back, like I said earlier, this original folklore from a culture that was now being Americanized, and watching it
Mhm.
evolve and change. So, like I said, African hags and that mythology and that folklore in Africa, they were a lot meaner. They were more of this vampiric life force type sucking, as opposed to, the British hags that were stealing children, and so
Mhm.
it coming over kind of had that element there. So when it came to it, when it came to primary sources and all, other than finding some storytellers from the culture, some old writings talking about it,
Mhm.
everything was pretty open ended with this one, because it was a more generalized story, right? It wasn't
Mhm.
a particular person, or a particular place.
Mhm. All right, so let's move on to the last story,
Yeah.
the Legend of Stuckey's Bridge.
Stuckey's
And
Bridge. Yeah.
can you tell us this story?
Yeah, well, Stuckey's Bridge. So this one doesn't have the depth of either of the other ones either. It's more like a good classic little southern small town tale. So it's right outside of Meridian, Mississippi, which is, on the western border of Mississippi, down there along the Gulf Coast. Meridian, it was an old railroad town. It was an old railroad town, and it's got a cute little downtown area and everything, But they say back in the late 19th century, at some point, as a railroad town, a group of outlaws came through town. They're called the Dalton Gang. Okay, these were train robbers, and they were headed out west to, do all their bidding, steal, thieve. Do what outlaws
Mhm.
do in the Wild West at that point. But when they came through town, they decided to leave a gentleman there, right? For whatever reason, whether he decided he saw opportunity in Meridian, whether he was just done with him, or maybe they kicked him out of the gang. Who knows, right? It was a gentleman by the name of Stuckey. And what Stuckey decided to do is, Stuckey saw that right outside of town there was this trail right along the river. It was called the Chunky River. All right, and which I know the name's funny, but it goes back to the native culture that was there. It
Mm.
was the Chunky is a very Americanized version of what amounts to Chunky, I believe, was the like,
Mhm.
yeah. And I'm sure I'm butchering it that way too, but so what this river kind of it came down, and this river was being used by travelers and peddlers, right? So folks who were coming into Meridian, they were bringing all their wares on a flatboat down into Meridian. They were selling their stuff, and then of course they were going back out of town, and they were leaving from there, right, and going back with all their money and everything they earned while they were in Meridian. Well, what Stuckey did is he decided to get a little piece of land out there on the Chunky River right outside of town, and he built a little inn. He built a little place right there where, if you were coming into town, needed a place to stay, you could rent a room, get a warm meal, right? This was pretty common on a lot of at
Mhm.
this point in time. These kind of inns, these traveler stops, they're up and down the Natchez Trace, all these sorts of places in the South, right? And so he did this, and there was a little bridge over the river. And what Stuckey would do at night is he'd go out there and he'd pace along the bridge with his lantern, and he'd call folks in from the river if he saw somebody floating down, right? So they'd come in, give him money to rent the room, get a little bit of food for the night. But of course, in the middle of the night, Stuckey wasn't all that nice of a guy, okay? Because what Stuckey would do is he would kill them. He would rob them, he would murder them, and he'd drag those bodies out to the banks of the Chunky River and he'd bury the bodies and sink them into the river. And he did this over and over again. And, this is how he made money. And this is how, he was taking care of himself. But eventually, I guess he got a little too greedy and folks started to notice that people weren't coming back from Meridian. Some of the people there, right? So, of course, they went into town and they went into town, asked the authorities about it. All these people are going missing on Chunky River and they're not coming back from Meridian. And the authorities, of course, it was not too hard to figure out where they were going missing, right? They knew
Mhm.
exactly who it was, and they went out and they got Stuckey, and they had a posse took Stuckey, and of course they hung him right from that bridge right there and killed him right then and there, hung him from the bridge. And part of the folklore is they say that later on, when they were doing construction of the bridge, they were putting a new bridge up there, and they were digging around there, they actually found the remains of some of the bodies there along the Chunky River that Stuckey
Mm.
had buried over the years. So to this day, if you drive down there outside of Meridian, okay, if you're driving not too terribly far, but you go to Chunky River, there's this road, and it's awful old, man. It is not even paved anymore, okay? It is an old Mississippi red dirt road. It'll take you down to Chunky River, and this bridge sits out there. This old iron bridge just
Mm.
rusting. It's falling apart. There's boards coming out from the bottom, and it is of course all graffitied up and everything. Everything is just rotting and everything. And it's become a bit of a legend tripper spot, right? High school kids like to go out there. People like to go out there and see. This is the place where Stuckey was hung, right? And so, of course, people say that when they're out there, they've seen things. People have said they've heard the splash in the water. They've seen Stuckey, seen that lantern kind of going back and forth, orbs going over the bridge. And of course, the scariest of all is a couple of people have talked about actually seeing the apparition of Stuckey hanging from underneath the bridge from where they killed him. So if you get a chance to go out there, I almost don't recommend it. I've been to Stuckey's Bridge, but it was during the daytime, and it was
Uh-huh.
definitely creepy, and it was really wet. It had rained before, and I came back with mud up to my knees. So yeah,
So it's not a recommended stop for you.
well, bring 4-wheel drive if it's raining. But yeah,
Yeah. So tell us about the historical facts
yeah.
behind this story.
Well, this one has absolutely no historical fact behind it whatsoever. I mean, almost. I'm joking about it, but in a lot of ways, it doesn't. It's a really good
Yeah.
indicator. It's a very, it's a story that kind of came up. This was a town that was in transition. This was a small Mississippi town that was in this new industrialization, this post Reconstruction mode at this point in time. They see folks like the Dalton brothers, the Dalton gang. They are real, real outlaws, and they were seeing them in headlines and everything. And they've got folks coming in and out of town on these trains that they don't know.
Mhm.
It's a South that's very, it's a small town that is growing rapidly at this point in time, and there's not a lot of trust there. So,
Mm.
we don't really know exactly how this particular story sprung up specifically, but it has been around for a really long time. And I tell you, what this one to me looks like the most is this old bridge has been out there, right? This old bridge has been out there all the way since the early 20th century. And
Mhm.
of course, it's not needed anymore after a while. It was the only way into Meridian at one point in time. But, with the interstate system and highways and everything, eventually you wouldn't travel to Meridian that way. So this
Mhm.
old bridge that really would have been only one lane, rickety bridge. It's a truss bridge, right? So you can picture it. It's out there rusting in the elements, and it sort of becomes a location like that spooky abandoned house down the road that we talked about earlier, where folks start
Mhm.
making up a story around it. And, so this one, most likely the origin of this story is more, here we have a landmark that's super creepy, that folks here in town know about. It's rotting out there. It needs something to really justify it at this point in time. And but
Mhm.
I will tell you, when I tell these stories, and that sounds. Sometimes folks say, "Oh, you sound really skeptical about this. That bridge is haunted." I'm not saying that the bridge isn't haunted. Okay, I'm not
Mhm.
saying that if you go out there in the middle of the night, you're not going to see something. I'm not saying that something
Mhm.
won't happen to you. I'm just
Yeah.
saying this story isn't necessarily why. And that bridge has been out there for over 100 years, so we might not know what actually is haunting it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so the Dalton gang though
Hmm.
was an actual outlaw gang.
Yes. Yes. Uh-huh.
But Stuckey himself, there's no records
No
of
record of a
that.
man named Stuckey, any way, shape, or form. No record that the Daltons ever even came to Meridian.
How
So,
interesting.
yeah.
And do people say there's, in Texas we have the Marfa lights
Hmm.
in West Texas, and
Yeah.
it's like a common thing for people to go out and see. I don't know that there's any stories about haunting around it, but it's like a phenomenon that is even studied by scientists.
Right.
Um, and so I'm curious if that would maybe be something that is actually happening at
Yeah.
Stuckey's Bridge, or if it's just like, I don't
Mhm.
know.
Well, this one isn't quite, like the lights, that phenomenon is very, very popular all over. I mean, there's,
Hmm.
Arkansas has them, Caroline's the Brown Mountain lights, the Gurdon lights in Arkansas. There are a lot of different places that have those, and those are very, very distinct things, very much that, people see them. I mean, it's
Hmm.
almost not even a question or a mystery that these lights exist. It's just why.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
the Brown Mountain lights are really famous because, just like you're saying, a lot of folks have caught pictures, and a lot of people have tried to study it and have
Hmm.
scientific origins. Where I come from, even down in Louisiana, the Cajuns had what they called Lafitte fillet, which
Hmm.
were lights out in the swamp. But most of the descriptions of at Stuckey's Bridge isn't quite of that origin. It's a little more ghost adventures than
Hmm.
than anything. Yeah.
But it sure is a fun story.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. And I joke about the bridge. You can actually, if you go on our website, I believe I posted some pictures from. It's been a few years since I've been out there, but um, you can certainly see some. It's an old rusty truss bridge out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of
Hmm.
pine trees, and that old Mississippi, over that old Mississippi River that's brown water. Just everything you think of when it looks like humidity, the pictures even, right?
Well, I'll definitely have to look up those pictures because now I'm really curious to see this
Yeah,
creepy old bridge.
yeah.
Well, did we miss anything that you feel like we need to talk about in relation to your podcast or any of these stories?
No, I mean, this is what I do, right? So I mean, this is what,
Hmm.
my show. It's Southern Gothic, and I tell stories like this. We research it. I don't, it's a scripted show, so it's not
Hmm.
quite in the same vein as like we're talking now. It's very much, it's narrated. Do
Hmm.
a lot of sound design. I like to really try and bring you inside the world, and make you feel like you're there in a historical sense, and make you feel like we're kind of inviting you into something new. So definitely, if you enjoy these stories, come listen. We'd appreciate it. So yeah.
My favorite part of your audio elements is when they have the whisper in the in between transitions where you just say
Oh,
Southern Gothic, and I
yeah,
love that part.
yeah,
That's such a fun little creepy element that is I don't know. I just get a little giggle every time.
It was fun to make about 6 years ago, and now I personally am tired of hearing it.
Oh, well, yeah, I would
You know?
imagine.
But yeah, we've got a lot of weird sound design and a lot of, stuff like that to really, spruce up the spooky. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming on the show. This is such a great topic for our Halloween episodes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I always love telling stories.
And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on this Southern Gothic journey. All the links that we discussed today will be, including the link to his podcast website, and his podcast will be on our website, www.fabricoffolklore.com. And so we want to hear from you. Have you heard of any of these tales that we talked about today? Do you have a favorite ghostly tale or a legend from the South? You can share these stories and more with us on our Facebook community page. This is where we continue the conversation. You can also connect with us on YouTube or listen on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast you are listening to. We also have social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X now that it's called. So connect with us in all those social medias. And if you are enjoying this show, make sure that you hit those 5 stars and write a review, because it's so helpful for new podcasts for people to write those reviews. So thank you again for unraveling the mysteries of folklore with us. I am Vanessa Y. Rogers. This is Fabric of Folklore. Until next time, keep the folk alive.